Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is Horror Trans. I am Stephanie Bree. I am a transgender woman who talks about all things horror. And for today's episode of Horror Icons, I'm doing something different. And I'm talking about the Amityville Horror House. Or the Amityville House. So the house um, is one of the few haunted house stories that is pervasive in American culture, pop culture. Um, the book was published in the late 70s. A movie was made in 79. And not only has that book and uh, film spawned an entire franchise, it's influenced copycats and it's referenced throughout pop culture. Um, it's referenced on in other horror movies. Whenever somebody wants to talk about something scary, they always compare it to the Amityville Horror. The Conjuring movies have a connection to the Amityville Horror House. Ed and Lorraine Warren, the real life investigators that the Ed and Lorraine Warren in the Conjuring universe are modeled after, investigated, allegedly, the haunting at Amityville. And if you know your hip hop music, um, Marshall Mathers referred to the place he grew up as Amityville in a song where he refers to himself as mentally ill from Amityville. That song can be found on his sophomore album, the Marshall Mathers LP. So Amityville is very, at least superficially well known in American horror culture, pop culture. But what about the house itself? Well, because the Amityville horror um, franchise does not all take place in the house. Um, in the films, we're just going to talk about the films for a second. It is established that a man whose name eludes me. This is true story. Actually, this really happened. A man um, murdered his family in that house, his entire family, brother, sister, parents, everybody, or his kids. I don't know. It was his whole family. The events of that night, that murder, are depicted in Amityville 2, um, which I don't remember the subtitle for Amityville 2, so I apologize for that. But he pleaded, or testified, I should say, in court that he was hearing voices, demonic voices that were telling him to kill, to murder. Later on in real life, a family moved into that house who allegedly witnessed some supernatural phenomenon that they couldn't explain. And so there was a big investigation led by Ed and Lorraine Warren from the Conjuring universe. The real life paranormal investigators, I should say, that those films are based on, loosely. And eventually it was um, it was ruled a hoax in real life. But in the fiction, the family um, in the movie are chased out of the house by the spirits in the house, and initially the film franchise follows the house in that it takes place in the house. The sequels, Amityville 3 does, and then starting with Amityville Part 4, the house is still haunted, but the items in the house are auctioned off. And in subsequent films, we follow um, haunted items from the house. Whether it's a clock or a lamp or whatever. But the house itself does keep coming back. Now, also, the Amityville haunting house is depicted in a lot of movies, not based on the real life Amityville events or families or homeowners, but just the house itself. Inspires a whole series of copycat movies with the word Amityville in the name that have no ties to the book and are not officially licensed in that they are, sanctioned or approved by those who were involved in the original Amityville story. But they exist, they're out there. So the house is a great big New England house by the lake. It has a basement, it has an attic, a full basement, a full attic, and it has multiple bedrooms on the first and second floor, um, a grand kitchen, and other rooms. There's also a boathouse on the property. We see, I believe there is a shed or possibly a garage that we see in at least one film. But basically, it's an iconic house in horror film and literature. So my experience with Amityville goes all the way back to childhood. Um, Before I started watching horror movies, before my family would even let me watch horror movies, which was early on, so I want to put that out there. I heard stories of the Amityville horror. Again, you hear it referenced in movies and TV shows and things. Um, Anytime there's a creepy house in a movie or a television sitcom, they always say, "Oh, this is just like the Amityville horror." But they never give any explanation or they never elaborate. So, um, up to about first or second grade, all I had to go on was the name Amityville Horror and the story my mom told me, who said it was a true story about a man who killed his family and the uh, demons and ghosts that haunted the house that the family moved into. Again, emphasizing that it was a true story. Now, my mom was an evangelical Christian, but she was also superstitious and believed ghost stories. My dad, not so much in my earlier years, but both of my parents did start showing me and my sisters, I would say scary movies at a young age, and then eventually horror movies as we got older and more ready for them. Starting with things like Gremlins and Beetlejuice, and we watched The Terminator at a young age, and then slowly started watching the Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and Child's Play movies together as a family. When I was in third grade, I read the book, The Amityville Horror. Now, in third grade, reading the book, I thought it was pretty scary. I really did. Um, I was very young. I didn't have a lot of experience with horror at that time. I'd seen some R-rated horror movies, like I said, some Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, etc. But my parents were still mostly shielding me from it. Or if we would watch it, they would be, very quick to point out that it's just ketchup or Kool-Aid. Don't be scared. It's just a movie, things like that. But they didn't have anything like that with Amityville because it was the movie they told us not to watch because they believed it really happened, and they were very superstitious. They were Southern Baptists, and they believed that if you watched the movie, you would invite the demons from the house or from the movie into our house. Like I said, they were superstitious. and so we weren't allowed to watch the movies. Um, so they had an aura of mystique about them. As I started, going to friends who had VCRs, houses, and renting horror movies with my friends, we started um, exploring the Amityville horror franchise. And it didn't take me long to realize that they're not good movies by and large. They aren't as scary as the book was when I was a kid. They were still scary, don't get me wrong, but I had seen worse by that time. So I wasn't as scared by them as I probably would have been had I seen them at a younger age. Um, to this day, I still find haunted house stories, haunted house movies, the scariest movies. The Conjuring, the first one, is one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. It's not necessarily a scary haunted house movie, but Hereditary is one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. Poltergeist is pretty scary. But that first Amityville horror, just the original from 1979, is not very scary. Now I can't comment on the remake because I haven't seen it. But I do know that the house is mostly the same house as depicted in that movie as it was in the original. And even though subsequent films don't focus entirely on the house, it's still a part of the franchise mythos, of the story. So it's like an item that had been in the house that is now possessed, located at another house outside of Amityville. As far as haunted houses go, I would argue the Amityville haunted house is probably the most famous haunted house, at least in American horror culture. I don't know how famous it is in the rest of the world because I don't live in the rest of the world. But I know here in America, it is definitely by far, like by miles, the most famous haunted house story. There are people who have never seen an Amityville horror movie in their lifetime, but they've heard it referenced. They've heard it mentioned. It's talked about. It's whispered in horror circles. So even horror fans, younger horror fans who maybe have never seen the Amityville horror, have at least heard of it and are familiar with it, at least on a surface level, which I think is telling um, in a lot of ways. Um, and my explanation for this is the events of the Amityville horror, the real life news story coupled with the movie, the book, and the sequels all came about right around the same time that the satanic panic was just ramping up in the United States. And I think that lent itself to spreading the fear in our culture because there were a lot of people in the evangelical circles who believed those hauntings were real and were using those stories to scare their kids, um, as my parents did. Um, I am a pagan. I am a pagan witch, so I do believe in supernatural stuff. But I'm kind of skeptical sometimes. I cannot say definitively if I believe that the Amityville house is or ever was haunted. I haven't done enough research, and I've never been there to say for myself if anything supernatural has ever happened. But it's still, an iconic haunted house and at least in American culture and especially in horror culture. Um, so that's my icon for the for this week, the Amityville Horror House.